Would you like to see the country of dollar billionaires? The people here are so rich that at one time they even used dollars as wallpaper and wrapping paper. They went shopping with carts full of dollars. Local artists created art objects out of them, and the lovers covered the floors with banknotes at the wedding. Everyone in this country was a dollar millionaire, if not a billionaire at all. However, there is one caveat: a millionaire with a house full of Zimbabwean dollars. How did it happen? Well, Zimbabwe has never been a prosperous country, even by African standards. Everything was very sad here, and in the early noughties, the government ran out of money. What has the government done? Maybe it has implemented some reforms, softened the conditions for trade, invested in production. No. These guys just started printing money. Real geniuses. This is undoubtedly the smartest decision that led to inflation of about 80 billion% per month and 96 trillion% per year in 2008. At some point, they stopped counting it at all, so maybe it was bigger. How much money did you need to print in order for the paper on which they were issued to be more valuable than themselves? Damn, there was a $100 trillion banknote. Prices for everything in the country doubled every 24 hours. Hyperinflation had destroyed the savings of every Zimbabwean, every business, and the government itself. A typical Zimbabwean grocery shopping trip in 2008 looked like this. He came to the market for bread, which cost about $15 billion. During the calculations, its price could rise. There is chaos everywhere, and no one understands how anyone can trade in such conditions. Therefore, many preferred black markets. You go there and trade some rare parrot for a couple of loaves of bread and a bottle of milk. You can also find a job, because there is not much of it in the country. As a result, Zimbabwe's financial system collapsed. In 2009, the country switched to the South African rand and the US dollar in order to maintain at least some stability. And so, in 2019, after 10 years of realizing its mistakes and economic reforms, the government returned the Zimbabwean dollar to circulation. And everything got better, isn't that right? Well, not really. In 2023, annual inflation in Zimbabwe reached 230%. Not bad, if we recall the figures for 2008. Well, last year, the government of Zimbabwe announced that it was introducing a new currency to replace the devalued old one. Zimbabwean Gold. That's the name, and this currency is linked to gold. Therefore, it is unlikely to face the same rapid decline as the Zimbabwean dollar. Oh, no. The day after the introduction of the Zimbabwean gold fell by as much as 435%. Therefore, Zimbabweans often use the currencies of other countries or crypto. You may ask, why is this so? What is going on in Zimbabwe that is always driving the country into economic hell? The first reason is that the location is not very good. Here's Zimbabwe on the map. The country has no access to the sea. There are neighbors around, with whom relations are so-so. If you want to trade with someone, you need to transport goods across their borders. The African borders are only for those who are willing to pay extra cash to a couple of officers. This is a corrupt paradise. So all Zimbabwean goods, and to be honest, they don't produce a lot of them, are subject to additional duties, if you can call them that. Because of this, Zimbabwe ranks 181st in the world in terms of trade per capita, out of 203. The second reason is the lack of production. Almost 17 million people live in Zimbabwe, and 2/3 of them are just doing basic farming to eat. Well, maybe the remaining ones are producing something, developing small and medium-sized businesses. Well, if the smuggling of tobacco, gold, and drugs can be called that. But you've probably heard that Zimbabwe has some of the largest gold reserves on Earth. Well, if you haven't, then now you know. So they extract it in large quantities, right? In 2024, Zimbabwe broke its own record and mined as much as 36 tons of gold. Somehow modest. This is the weight of a light Chinese Tor 80 tank, for example, but we're talking about official figures. And according to experts, another 70 tons of gold are missing from the country and are being smuggled out. In addition to gold, chromium, platinum, and lithium are mined in Zimbabwe. That's all. All other industries in the country are absent. It is not able to compete in this even with its neighbours, not to mention the more developed countries of the world. Zimbabwe has to import almost everything: clothing, food, chemicals, manufactured goods, and energy. The country is catastrophically dependent on imports, while exporting practically nothing. The third reason for the current state of Zimbabwe, I promise I won't tell you for a long time, is historical. Imagine, you and your friends are simple guys from Bantu tribes. You live in Zimbabwe, grow millet and corn, dance and trade with each other, sleep in your cool clay houses. But then, the Portuguese come to you without asking and say, "Now this is our land." And then the British drop in without asking and say, "No, this is our land." And of course, you won't be happy about this. But the British are offering you some weapons, money, and some other cool things in return for mining minerals on your territory. Basically, it's a normal deal. What could possibly go wrong here? Yes, about everything. In 1895, businessman and politician Cecil Rhodes, referring to an agreement with the tribes, founded the British colony of Southern Rhodesia in Zimbabwe. Its inhabitants quickly mined gold there, took land from the indigenous people, and drove it to reservations. Their sentiments were so racist that Kanye West, with his recent tweets against these guys, would seem to you the most tolerant person in the world. Whites owned most of the farms, mines, businesses, and lands in the country. Local tribes staged several small uprisings, but they were harshly suppressed. As a result, the indigenous population had to go into hard and low-paying jobs, an academic example of colonization. After World War II, African countries decided that it was time for the whites to get out of their territories. In Rhodesia, the Zapu and Zanu movements took up this task. They demanded equal rights for the black population from the government. But the government responded with something like, "Keep working for food and keep your head down." But the Western world supported the indigenous people and imposed sanctions against Rhodesia to help them. The war of whites against blacks began in the country, which lasted for almost 15 years. In 1980, Southern Rhodesia became independent and was renamed Zimbabwe. Hooray! The indigenous people have won. However, there is almost no economy. There are a lot of victims and destruction around. Who will come and save the country? You know him. Well, if not, then you've probably heard his last name somewhere. Here he is, Robert Mugabe, the leader of the ZANU movement. A true patriot and the savior of Zimbabwe. Well, that's probably how he saw himself. In fact, everything was a little different. After coming to power, Mugabe decided to change the Senate and kill about 20,000 people who disagree with his political position. He also worked with his friends from the government on his favourite African pastime, corruption. His people ran large enterprises and regulated all trade in Zimbabwe. To develop small and medium-sized businesses? No thanks, we don't do that. It's better to subsidize some state-owned enterprise of Mugabe's second cousin. But don't think that Mugabe didn't try at all. He even carried out liberal economic reforms, established ties with developed countries, and made healthcare and education more accessible to the local population. But in the late 1990s, Mugabe decided to return the lands of the former white colonialists to his friends. Oh, that is, to the local population. He used the best methods for this: corruption, violence, and threats. As a result, fertile lands were given to those who did not know how to farm at all. It turned out that the whites were not so useless. At least they provided the country with food. There was a shortage of food in Zimbabwe, and hyperinflation began. And in 2000, elections were held in the country. In general, Mugabe and his party lost these elections, but they decided not to. There will be no loss. We will remain in power, and if you disagree, we have wonderful prison. After this, Western countries decided that it was time for Mugabe to cool off, so they imposed a lot of sanctions on the country. Russia and China, by the way, did not do this. Russia and Zimbabwe have been brothers for almost a century. Even during Zimbabwe's struggle for independence, the USSR sent weapons and money to its African friends and invested in infrastructure. Nowadays, Russia is certainly interested in the minerals of Zimbabwe. But back to Mugabe, there are no political ties. No one wants to trade with you. and no one wants to borrow money from you. Your agriculture is in wild decline. The figures have dropped by almost 50% after the reform of land acquisition from the whites. There are riots on the street. There is not enough food. There is no work. Well, then the great hyperinflation happens, which we talked about at the very beginning of the video. Mugabe graciously agrees to make a deal with the opposition in 2009 amid an economic disaster and low ratings. Some of the sanctions against Zimbabwe have been lifted, but this has not helped the country much. To consolidate his success with the seizure of land from whites, Mugabe decided in 2013 that it was time to take away some enterprises from the ex-colonialists. Guess what? This also turned out to be a terrible idea and another kick in the economy. I don't know how it was even alive. In 2017, the military thought it was time to get over it, and so Mugabe was politely asked to resign. Well, politely, with the help of a military coup. After Mugabe's death in 2019, he was buried in the capital of Zimbabwe, and they even honor him as a national hero. Well, what about Zimbabwe now? Maybe it's time for liberalization, democratization, and all the wonderful things that civilization brings to us. Is Zimbabwe about to turn into a modern, prosperous country? Well, no, probably not. Although good things are also being done there now. For example, farms taken away in the 2000s are returned to white farmers who really care about these lands. But not that it's unexpected, only a few dozen people agreed to return. The Zimbabwean authorities even agreed to pay them money as compensation, $3.5 billion, not Zimbabwean. But then again, it's not entirely clear where they'll get the money, considering that there is still unemployment, inflation, and food problems in the country today. This man is Emmerson Mnangagwa, the current president of Zimbabwe. He has not yet killed 20,000 political opponents like Mugabe. That's why he's probably a better president. But that's not accurate. Mnangagwa stands for economic liberalization and good relations with all countries in the world, of course. But he has already managed to severely suppress several mass protests. In 2023, he won the election, but international observers and the opposition, well, expressed some doubts. But who cares about their opinion, right? It just depends on whether Zimbabwe will continue to sell its gold and buy clothes, medicines, and food. And finally, here are two side-by-side bits of news about Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has been hit by a terrible drought this year. With food, everything is sad, so officials allowed 200 elephants to be slaughtered in order to feed people. Yes, people will eat pancake elephants to keep from starving. At the same time, a couple of months ago, the Zimbabwean authorities announced that they plan to build their own launch vehicle with the help of Russia and send their cosmonaut into orbit. Zimbabwe is such an interesting country.